Right, so let's talk a bit more about tides. With tides, you have to find your first time is at your primary port. There's many different ports up the east coast of Queensland, starting from the Gold Coast right up to North Queensland. You always start at your primary port. As an example, Brisbane is a primary port. And then you always have what we call secondary places that you can use to zoom in on your primary port initial time of the tide. But with the secondary ports, they'll have a subtraction or maybe an addition of time, normally only a few minutes, but it makes a big difference. Normally you wouldn't worry about 5 minutes or so, but if it's any more than 35 minutes or 40 minutes or an hour, then it's definitely worth paying attention to. It makes a big difference to the time of the tide in that particular location. So, as an example, here's a tide book. This is just a small one just for the southeast Queensland area. There are larger books that cover the whole Queensland coast, or you can have these sort of pamphlets that are very specific to a local area, but the one thing they all have in common is primary port. This is the Brisbane example I just mentioned, and then we have a whole list of secondary places on the back of it. In this little booklet here, this whole booklet is all about Brisbane, so every single page covers a month of the year for Brisbane as a primary port, and then on the back side of it there's a whole page that has different times for specific locations that you can use. These are called secondary locations that you can use around the major port of Brisbane. Right, so the question that you have to answer through the test here now is talking about a tide for Cleveland on the 4th of September. It's the high tide you're looking for in the morning, and for that you have to go to the primary port, which is Brisbane first. Now I've got some information up here on the board. So here we go. 5:20 a.m. is the high tide in the morning for that particular day, but that's for Brisbane, not Cleveland. So we then come down to our secondary places. We look for Cleveland Point. You go across, it says plus 13 minutes for that location. So you simply add 13 minutes to the time, the initial time. So 5:20 plus 13 minutes gives you a time of 5:33. So the high tide, which is 1.51 metres, is at 5:33 for Cleveland, not 5:20 as it is for the Port of Brisbane. The Port of Brisbane, by the way, is the Brisbane Bar, or the mouth of the river. Okay, so that example we just talked about can be applied basically anywhere. Another example of that for around here, I suppose, would be a place like 1770. That's a secondary place, not a primary port. So the primary port for that area would be Gladstone. You would check the Gladstone tide times, get the heights, the times for the tides for that port first, and then do the secondary location at 1770. Most likely have to add a small bit of time there to get the exact time for 1770 where you will be. Okay, so if you're wondering where our heights come from, what that actually means, you have to learn a little bit about what we call LAT, or lowest astronomical tide. Basically, that is a chart datum. That's a very low tide taken many years ago. That's what they use as a datum for the chart. So if you look at a proper nautical chart, there's often depth readings. They're normally metric, all the newer ones are, so 3 metres could be an example, it could be 3.5 metres, but that is what you're going to have in that particular area. As a rough estimate, I suppose, it can change, sandbars do change, so it's possible, but that's your general depth, and then you add your height of the tide, which you get from your tide time booklets, on top of that. So this example here, on a chart it would say 3 metres as a depth reading. Your tide says it's going to be high tide at 5 o'clock in the morning, 1.51 metres. You would add that to the chart depth to get 4.51 metres for that morning in that area. So, very important thing to understand. Charts have your depth readings, normally in metric readings, and it's certainly worth having, very good information to have. Okay, so a little bit more information without trying to get too complicated. Tides, really it's all about the gravitational pull of the sun versus the earth, and also of course the moon. Looking at this diagram here, we all know the earth takes basically a year, 365 days to circle the sun, and then we have the moon, it takes about 28 days thereabouts to circle the earth. So we have these 4 moon phases that you have to deal with. Most people will be familiar with the full moon and our big tides, commonly known as spring tides. Well, that's the same for the new moons as well. So every couple of weeks thereabouts, we have a few days around the new moon and a few days around the full moon where the tides are the largest. They call our spring tides. Essentially, we have our highest highs and our lowest lows in the same day, which simply means very strong tidal flows. So that's imperative for your safe boating there. And then the other two moon phases are what we call our first and last quarters, commonly known as neap tides in those times of the month. So our highest lows and our lowest highs in the same day, which simply means our tidal flows are nowhere near as severe. So overall, very important information. It's going to be of benefit to learn about your tides and pay attention to your tide and your moon phases. Right. So the other thing just to understand with tides is you don't have the same tidal flow the whole time. We have a tide change every 6 to 6.5 hours, but for the whole 6 hours or so, it doesn't flow at the one speed. It gradually starts coming in, then really gets a run on, and then slows down at the peak of the tide or to the top of the tide as an example. So we have a thing called the rule of twelfths that helps to explain this. So we have, let's say, approximately 6 hours per tide. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In the first hour, 1/12 of the total tidal flow will approximately come in. The second hour, 2/12. The third hour, 3/12. The fourth hour, 3/12. The fifth hour, and so on. So you can clearly see the first hour, a very small majority of the total height flows, and then it really does get a run on. And here, the middle 2 hours of the tidal flow is 50% of the full volume. So that's where your current or your tidal flow is the strongest, and then it slows back down again. So on the top or bottom of a tide, you have an hour or so where it's basically called slack water, where you don't have a lot of tidal flow at all. But in between that, you can have some very severe tides, meaning the tidal flows, particularly around the full moons and the new moons, so our spring tides in other words.